Shalom Aleichem, welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs, and I am delighted to welcome you all to this evening's program, The Siege of Sidney Street, the East End of London's most sensational shootout with Andrew Whitehead. Before we get started, a few things to note. Your video will be off and your audio will be muted throughout the program. You may send us questions via the question panel located at the lower right of your screen. We ask that you refrain from comments and keep questions short so that we can try to get to everyone's questions this evening. I'm delighted to introduce this evening's presenter, Andrew Whitehead. Andrew is an historian, lecturer, and freelance journalist. He spent 25 years working as a correspondent and presenter and editor at BBC World Service News. Andrew teaches American undergraduates in London for Global Education Oregon and is a visiting professor at the Asian College of Journalism in Chennai, South India. He's also an honorary professor at the University of Nottingham. Welcome, Andrew.
Lisa, thank you. And it's wonderful to be on this webinar today. Thank you ever so much for extending the invitation. And it's a real honor to be kicking off the Center's fall webinar program.
Thank you. And over to you. I really appreciate your being here at this late hour in England. So on with the show.
I'm tempted to say good morning, though it's only the morning here by a couple of minutes, so it doesn't really count. I'm now going to press my share button, and I will be sharing with you my presentation, which I hope you can now see on your screens. That's my book, A Devilish Kind of Courage, Anarchists, Aliens, and the Siege of Sidney Street, which was published just a few months ago. I'm going to start with a quote. Nothing of the sort had been seen within living memory in quiet, law-abiding, comfortable England. That was the comment of the Home Secretary of the day, somebody you'll have heard of, and I'll reveal his name in just a moment, about what I would describe as the most sensational shootout in London's history. This is January 1911, and the venue is Sidney Street in Stepney. Stepney was then at the heart of the overwhelmingly Jewish East End of London. This was the area where Jewish migrants, people fleeing pogroms and oppression in the Tsarist Empire in Eastern Europe, came in large numbers, about 160,000 migrants in the 2 decades before the First World War. And at that stage, the borough of Stepney, or the western part of the borough of Stepney in the East End of London, was about 80% Jewish. And in this shootout, 2 emigre gunmen, one a Latvian anarchist and the other a Russian, perhaps not an anarchist, kept armed police and then army sharpshooters at bay for fully 6 hours, with about 1,000 bullets fired by one side or another. The 2 men who were being besieged were wanted for a triple police murder a couple of weeks earlier when the police interrupted an attempt at an armed robbery of a jeweller's shop nearby. This is the cover of a pamphlet, The Battle with the London Anarchists, which was a pull together issued within 3 days of the gun battle of photographs and reporting in the local press. London is not used to armed shootouts, and this particular incident was a sensation, particularly for the new breed of tabloid papers making use of very sensational style reporting, using first-hand eyewitness accounts from their journalists when they could, and using something very new, action photographs. So this was published, as I say, within 72 hours, selling for a penny. And what happened in Sidney Street was also captured by an entirely new news phenomenon. As many as 5 newsreel cinematographers got to the scene of the shootout while it was still underway, and the footage of 3 of these newsreel companies is still extant, and you can find it on YouTube. One of the most dramatic moments of breaking news ever captured on film. And this is the Home Secretary I was talking about. He's the guy with the silk top hat. This is, of course, standard wear when you go to the East End of London. That, by the way, is a British sense of humour. Winston Churchill. He was then 35, so very young for such a senior position. And he was a liberal, and I say liberal with a capital L. He was a member of a Liberal Party cabinet. He wasn't at this stage of his career a conservative. And here he is at the scene of the shootout with Scots Guards, with police. That's a detective wearing the gabardine overcoat, and with a fire brigade officer. Perhaps not wise of him to go to the scene. It completely upended the conventional chain of command for a live action operation, but he absolutely insisted in going. And he was the only person, apart from the two gunmen, who'd used the very formidable form of semi-automatic pistol that the gunmen had, the Mauser broom handle, which Churchill had actually used and killed with when on active service in Sudan. And this is the other man who is associated with the Siege of Sidney Street, a Latvian anarchist who went by the nom de guerre, if you like, of Peter the Painter. That was a translation of his Latvian nickname. He was an industrial painter. The London police got this photograph from the police in Marseille when they were looking for Peter the Painter. They never found him. And when they were trying to find out more about him. And it is the antithesis of what you would expect from an early 20th century anarchist. You know, you've got that wonderfully groomed pointed moustache, his hair very neatly cut and combed. He's wearing a high collar and a smart tie and is in a suit. And he has that air of confidence with the camera. He became something of an East End anti-hero. The police never let on, but they did actually discover his real name, Janis Zaklis, a Latvian. They knew the address of the family farm in Latvia. He wasn't present at Sidney Street, but he was certainly involved behind the scenes. He was probably the guy that was going to take the proceeds of the jewelry robbery, if it had succeeded, to the continent and to pass it on to the Latvian anarchist movement in Latvia and to the families of their political prisoners. This is a poster that the London police issued when they were looking for Peter the Painter, with both the photographs that they got from the police in Marseille. A £500 reward. That would be, I think, about $80,000 in today's money. So a very considerable reward. I said that the police knew his name. The reason why they didn't actively search for him is they knew that he was out of the UK. They believed he was in Germany the following year. They hadn't got enough evidence to extradite or indeed to convict. So when a few years later, the police in Australia got in touch with their London counterparts and said, "We think we've captured Peter the Painter," all the London police could say was, well done, but he's of no interest to us. We have no evidence, so you might as well let him go. So whether they had the right Peter the Painter or not, we don't know, but they let him go. Latvian anarchists. What were Latvian anarchists doing in London in 1910, 1911? This is a rather wonderful picture of a group of Latvian anarchists in Latvia, which the British consulate there got from the police in Latvia. Latvia was then part of the Tsarist Russian Empire, and shared with the police in London. The two central people with the 1 and 2 numbers, man and woman, had been at various times active in London. They weren't involved in Sidney Street. But again, it's a marvelous group photograph of a group of young, politically committed men. Latvia at that time was a small but prosperous part of the Russian Empire. It was more industrialized than most of Russia. It had big ports, Riga on the Baltic Sea. When the 1905 attempt at a revolution got going in St. Petersburg, that movement spread very quickly to Riga, the Latvian capital, and large crowds took to the streets to demand the Tsar step down, to demand social justice, and for Latvians as well to demand a measure of autonomy for their Latvian homeland. They had their own language, they had their own political culture and traditions, they had in many ways a separate religious identity as well. And the repression of the revolutionary movement in Latvia was so severe by the Tsarist forces that some young Latvians decided that the only way that they could keep their movement alive was by taking up arms. And they bought quite powerful semi-automatic weapons on black markets in Antwerp, in Helsinki, and elsewhere. And within that left-wing revolutionary movement, there was in due course a fracture between those who were basically Bolsheviks and Marxists, and a more hardline element which objected to the idea of the supremacy of the party and ruled out any question of taking part in elections, and who organized as anarchists. In the aftermath of the failed Latvian Revolution and its very violent suppression, which involved abductions, executions, and an element of sexual violence as well by the Tsarist forces, about 2,500 young Latvians went into exile, many to the United States, but also to Germany, to France, and to Britain. And probably about 150 of them were sympathetic to anarchism. Organized as anarchists, they had their own very small circulation Latvian anarchist journals, and there was a Latvian diaspora which kept in contact with each other certainly in Philadelphia, in Paris, in Marseille, probably in Frankfurt, and certainly in London. And this is also an indication that the people involved in the Latvian revolutionary movement were young, they were educated, and they were middle class. This was not what you might call a lumpen anarchist movement. It was an anarchist movement which recruited among young, radicalized students and former students and young professionals who were radicalized by the scale of the opposition from the Tsarist forces and really deeply angered and embittered, perhaps by experiencing torture themselves or by knowing friends who'd been tortured or killed without any judicial process as part of the suppression of the revolutionary movement. When some of this number came to London, small numbers, we're probably talking about maybe as few as 15 Latvian anarchists who were politically active as anarchists in London. They moved into the East End. Not that all the Latvians were Jewish, but it was where East European migrants to London congregated. And there was already in the East End of London a very sizable anarchist movement. They were led by, if led is the right word for an anarchist movement, their foremost figure was Rudolf Rocker, a German Gentile who had taught himself Yiddish. That's him on the left with the glasses on that group photograph of leading East End mainly Jewish anarchists. They had a weekly paper, Der Arbeiterfreund, the Workers' Friend, which didn't finally close until 1928, and at its peak had a really remarkable print run of 4,000 copies a week. And on the right is a drawing of the Anarchist Club in Stepney, very close to the site of the Siege of Sidney Street. It was a disused Methodist chapel, but it was large. It had two large meeting places, room for a cafeteria and a library. It took political newspapers from Eastern Europe. And next door to it, that smaller building, was where Der Arbeiterfreund was printed. It was their production plant. It was their printing plant. And the club allowed people from Eastern Europe to enter without any restriction. We didn't have to be a member. And it's where the Latvian anarchists gathered. It was their social base. It's where they ate. It's where they talked to colleagues in Russian or German or Yiddish. It's where they read newspapers from home. It's where they attended popular dramatic performances. It's where they took part in balalaika concerts. And these are photographs from that time of actually not the anarchist club, but the building next door, which was where the printing plant was based. And you can see on the walls rather faint but clear posters in Yiddish, in Hebrew script. The anarchists in London believed that carrying out armed crime, wages robberies, jewelry robberies, whatever, to raise money for their movement was entirely politically justified. They may be that may be a bizarre belief, but they believed that whatever they did to keep their movement alive and to support the families of their political prisoners was politically justified. And they certainly took part in a couple of armed robberies which went wrong before a really big attempt to rob this jewellery shop, Harris's jewellery shop, in Houndsditch, so very close to the city of London, just 2 or 3 minutes from Liverpool Street Station, for any of you who have a sense of the layout of London. This shop, Jewish run, had in its safe about £7,000 in prices of those days of jewellery. That would be round about $1.2 million worth of items by today's value. And what the anarchists did is they hired a building in this cul-de-sac, a building on the left, just near to where you can see that rather outsized gas lamp. They hired that building because that building backed on directly to the back of the jewelry shop they were trying to break into. This area was both commercial and residential. The anarchists hired the building, saying that a family wanted a home, and a woman and 2 men moved in there several weeks before the robbery attempt and gave every impression of being a normal family. This was an overwhelmingly Jewish area. Harris's was a Jewish-run business. The jewelry shop shut on Friday afternoon and didn't reopen until Sunday morning. So when, in December 1910, the anarchists decided to excavate their way in, they started on a Friday evening, thinking that they basically had 36 hours to break into the back of the shop, break the safe, and get away with the contents of the safe. And they had a lot of equipment. They had cutting equipment. They had a big canister of gas to power the cutting equipment. They had lots of specialist cutting tools, some of which they had fashioned over several months in an engineering workshop, actually a workshop run by another anarchist, Enrico Malatesta, an Italian. And they began chipping away late in the Friday evening, but they hadn't really thought it through. So the Jewish Sabbath obviously is a time when there's very little activity in the streets, not much activity in people's homes, and it was very quiet. And the tap, tap, click, click away noise of the gang trying to break their way into the back of the jewelry shop stood out on a Friday evening. And one of the neighbors went out about 10 o'clock at night looking for a uniformed policeman to report a suspicion of something happening there that shouldn't have. He found a policeman. The policeman identified which of these buildings in the back of the jewelry shop the noise was coming from. He knocked on the door. Man answered, opened the door a few inches. The police constable, who was very new in the job, didn't really have a good conversational gambit. So he simply said, "Is the missus in? Is the wife in?" Which wasn't a terribly intelligent way of opening the conversation. The man simply said no. The policeman said, "Okay, I'll come back later," and went away. He was by then fairly convinced that there was a robbery underway, and he went back to the local police station to raise the alarm. You would have thought the gang, having been interrupted by a uniformed police officer, might have thought the game was up and tried to get out before the police arrived in force. Actually, strangely, they didn't. They persisted in trying to break their way into the back of the jeweller's shop. And about 10:30 at night, as many as 9 police officers, all unarmed in the British tradition, arrived here. Several were at the front of the jeweler shop, 1 or 2 at the end of this cul-de-sac. 5 of them entered the cul-de-sac. A police sergeant again knocked on the door of the house that the gang were based in. The same man from inside opened the door. He stepped back. The sergeant walked 1 step into the building, and a second man in the gang ran down the internal staircase of that building, firing a semi-automatic pistol directly at the police officer. The police officer reeled backwards, fell to the ground, and he had suffered fatal injuries. The gang, there were probably 6 of them in the house, including one woman, then had to get through the rest of the police to the end of the cul-de-sac to be able to make their getaway. 3 of them had guns. All of them used those guns. And over about 20 seconds, they fired at least 14 shots, and they inflicted fatal injuries on 3 police officers and seriously injured 2 others. It was at the time, and it remains to this day, in terms of deaths and injuries, the most serious single incident endured by the police in London ever. But in the confusion, late at night, the gang also managed accidentally to shoot one of their own. This guy, George Gardstein, he had been one of the main architects of the robbery attempt. I'm using as evidence the City of London police records, which are remarkably comprehensive. Not my only source, but the principal source. George Gardstein, a Latvian, an anarchist. Even the police described him as very handsome. He suffered 2 bullet wounds to his back and was bleeding profusely, but still alive. And his comrades lifted him over their shoulders, 2 of them, with a woman walking behindhand as a little bit of a decoy, and walked him back to one of their rooms in East London as if he was a Friday night drunk who needed help from his friends to get home. It took them quite a long time walking through the back streets to get George Gardstein to safety. And then his comrades scarpered. They ran, leaving the seriously injured man in the care, if that's the right way of putting it, of 2 young women who were on the fringes of the gang. They were, one of them at least was the girlfriend of one of the gang members. In fact, one of them had an association with George Gardstein. So there they were late on a Friday night with a seriously injured, probably dying man on their settee. The gang had left an automatic pistol tucked down the side of the settee, and they were absolutely panic-stricken. They didn't have good English. They didn't know what to do. They did manage to get a doctor to come and look at him in the middle of the night, got him some painkillers. But by the following morning, George Gardstein was dead. The police found his body after a tip-off from the doctor late the following morning, and they took these post-mortem photographs because they wanted to use them on posters to try and find out who is this man, who are his associates, who are these people who are responsible for this outrageous triple police murder. And these are 2 of the wanted photographs of George Gardstein. Some of the post-mortem photographs were with his eyes propped open, and again a reward of £500. So as I say, $70,000, $80,000 in today's money. And it took them actually a week to work out where George Gardstein had actually lived and to search all his papers, but they did eventually manage to put a name to him. But by then, many of the people in the gang had scarpered. They had run. So probably the same night, one of the gang, Max Smoller, managed to escape by boat to France. Peter the Painter probably got out the next day to the Netherlands. The woman in the gang, Nina Vasileva, tried to get out to Paris, but when she left her rooms in the East End, she was so spooked by the intense police presence, and she felt she was being followed and under supervision, that she turned back and went home. But 2 of the gang decided that they would hide very close to the Anarchist Club in Sidney Street in a room of the girlfriend of one of the 2 men, a woman called Betsy Gershon. She was Jewish, Russian. She worked in the tailoring trade. And one of the 2 men, William Sokolov, had an on-off relationship with her. The 2 men hid in that room, that single room, which didn't have a wash basin or a private toilet or any cooking facilities, for fully 2 weeks without being found, or indeed without any clear suspicion from other families who lived in this boarding house that there were two wanted men hiding there. But after a couple of weeks, the two men, William Sokolov and Fritz Svars, felt they needed a new hiding place. And they got a message out to a comrade to come and visit them in their hiding place. And they said to this comrade, find us somewhere new to live. Get us out of this area. The police presence looking for the triple police murders is so pervasive, we can't last for very long here. So this man, their comrade, said, okay, I'll find you a place. Stay here for another day or two. I'll let you know when I've found you a place, and then we'll get you out of the East End. One of the men, Fritz Svars, also wrote this letter, handwritten in Latvian script, back to his family in Latvia, which he asked his other comrade, the one who was finding a new hiding place, to ensure was returned, posted back to his family. I can read an extract from it. In this letter, Fritz Svars, Latvian anarchist, says, 2 weeks I've been on the run. How much longer I can manage, I don't know. To leave soon doesn't bear thinking about because they're guarding all the roads intensely. I'm not at all depressed because everyone knows that one has to die at some time. So he had a sense that he was not going to be able to get out alive from his hiding place, and he was right. This letter, though, never got to his family, at least not until very recently, because he handed it over to his comrade, who was a police informer, who handed the letter to the police, and the original of the letter is still in the police archives in an archive institute in London. So the police believed they knew where their two wanted men, wanted for the police murders, were hiding. And over the 2nd of January, they spent the day quietly deploying several hundred men around the house, front, back, blocking off all entrances and at a distance as well. Some keeping the house under surveillance, some taking over a house opposite quite quietly, where a number of armed police were deployed. On the morning of the 3rd of January 1911, at about 7 o'clock in the morning, so first light basically, one of the policemen went up with some gravel and threw it at the window of the room in which the two gang members were believed to be hiding. And that was greeted by a volley of shots from inside. So they knew their men were there. And that was the beginning of the siege. The police had a fairly desultory collection of weapons, old pistols, army issue rifles, not very effective. The Latvians were much better armed. They had 3 semi-automatic pistols. They had a lot of ammunition, and they had the run of the house. The house was otherwise empty now, so they could fire from windows on all 4 floors, at the front and at the back. And a protracted gun battle started, which, in essence, the police initially were losing. So at about 10 o'clock in the morning, the police took the remarkable step. It just doesn't happen in London, or at least only about once a century, of asking the army for assistance. And a police officer went to the Tower of London and got 24 Scots Guards, volunteers in uniform, to come, rifles on shoulders, to Sidney Street and take up position on the street. So these were some of the Scots Guards. Of course, the shootout, and then the sight of Scots Guards marching with rifles on shoulders through the streets of London created a sensation in the area, and hundreds and hundreds, thousands in the end, of local people came to crowd round and see what was happening. And you can see from this photograph that there's huge crowds pressing behind the police line. All those balconies in the distance are occupied as much as they possibly can be. On the right is the doorway of a pub. And that is where the press assembled, not for once having a drink in the bar, but insisting that the public can allow them admission to his roof, which offered a fantastic vantage point over the besieged house. The publican demanded a gold sovereign for each journalist admitted, And by my reckoning, he made more than $3,000 in today's money simply by allowing journalists onto his roof. But even with the Scots Guards in position, the firing continued. The two men didn't run out of ammunition. Scots Guard fired in large numbers. They took over houses opposite. They took over a bottling plant of a brewery, which overlooked the besieged house, but still the stalemate continued. The authorities were desperate to end the shootout before dark because they were worried that under nightfall, either the two gunmen in the besieged house might try and break out, or that some of their comrades may stage an armed attempt to rescue them, which, even if it was unsuccessful, could lead to injuries and loss of life. And here we've got Churchill, by the way, at the scene. He's the guy on the right with the silk hat peering out from the yard of another pub on the street. And you've got that local kid sitting on the roof above, waving at the camera. I've always wondered who he is. Churchill insisted after the event that he went there as a show of support for the police and troops, not to take operational charge. But journalists who were within earshot said Churchill did nothing but issue directions. Go there, come back, do that, do this. So there was a real confusion about who was in charge, which I think Churchill was to blame for. And he admitted later that he was wrong to have given in to his curiosity and gone to the scene of a live security operation. But while he was still there, at about midday, so we're now 5 hours into the siege and the shootout, some smoke, wisps of smoke, appeared from the besieged building, and within a few minutes that became clouds of smoke, and then little bit of licks of flame were appearing out of the windows of the besieged house. Nobody was quite sure how the fire started, but when the fire brigade arrived to douse the flames, they were told by local police, don't go any further, don't train any hoses on this blaze, we're firing out burglars, with the clear implication that the police started the blaze, which is actually what the newspapers reported the next day. The Home Office later denied that the police started the blaze, but that was certainly the impression they gave at the time. Churchill also absolutely instructed the fire brigade officer not to try and put out the flames. He said later he was simply thinking of the safety of the fire officers, but clearly the fire was one way of ending the siege. And the last shots from inside the building were heard at about 1:30 in the afternoon. By 2 o'clock, the fire brigade was allowed to try and douse the flames. Here they are with their ladder in position. The second floor room was the one in which the two gunmen had been hiding in. And half an hour later, the fire brigade, having stopped the active fire, broke into the back of the house, and they found the body of one of the gunmen prone on the floor, and it took them several hours to realize that the charred remains of a second gunman was also on the floor. An inquest decided that one of the two gunmen had been killed by a bullet, presumably fired by one of the soldiers, and the other one died of smoke inhalation. This was a sensation for the press. Journalists had the rare opportunity of being present at a breaking news story, and it was as the tabloid press and a new, more sensational style of journalism was just getting going. The Daily Mirror on the left, one of the biggest selling daily papers, put a photograph from Sidney Street all across its front page the next morning, and inside it had as many as 20 photographs in that day's edition, all from Sidney Street or about Sidney Street. And the same was true of virtually all of the London daily papers. But it was also the occasion for some really poisonous anti-Semitism. So I said the Latvians, most of the Latvian anarchists were not Jewish, but they were seen as emanating from the Jewish East End. And the cartoon on the right appeared in The People, which was a mainstream Sunday newspaper, and it shows rats with Semitic features labeled undesirable alien. Alien was then the descriptive word for anybody who was a poor foreigner, who were being told to clear out from a foreign country and entering Britain through gaps in the gate labeled Aliens Act. There had been an Aliens Act passed a few years earlier to try and limit mass immigration, but this cartoon was saying it wasn't doing the job. The gaps were so much that all sorts of undesirable aliens like the Latvian anarchists were coming into this country and doing no good. And the people also published a doggerel poem, doggerel okay, but nevertheless a poem which called for the immediate expulsion of all Jews from Britain without exception straight away. So the reaction to the Siege of Sidney Street was to allow more virulent anti-Semitism than I think we'd ever seen before in the mainstream daily press appear to be a proper form of discourse. The government, the Liberal government, came under huge pressure to tighten up the immigration law and to restrict the right of asylum. The Liberal government actually rode out the storm. It didn't tighten the immigration law. It didn't restrict the right of asylum. In fact, the only policy change was to make available to the police in London more effective firearms in those rare cases where they were dealing with armed crime. The police were also under huge pressure to convict some of those involved in the police murders and the Siege of Sidney Street. But 3 of them were dead, 2 in the Sidney Street fire, 1 killed by his own comrades in the aftermath of the robbery attempt. 2 others at least had fled the country. That left 1. This is Nina Vasileva, a Latvian anarchist, Jewish, Yiddish first language, who was arrested by the police in February 1911 in the East End. She was one of 4 people who were put on trial as a result of the police murders. She was charged not with murder, but with conspiracy to rob. There was no evidence that she'd been involved in the murder directly or knew that her colleagues were armed. It'd be difficult to imagine that she was innocent of that fact. She was the only one convicted, the only person ever convicted in any trial linked to the triple police murder or the Siege of Sidney Street. And she was sentenced to 2 years in jail. She appealed. Her appeal was heard very promptly by the Lord Chief Justice at the Old Bailey in London, and she won her appeal. The Lord Chief Justice accepted that on balance, she was a respectable young woman who was led astray by her Latvian anarchist boyfriend. So after a couple of months in jail, she walked free and she lived in London all the rest of her life. And I leave my my opening remarks for now. This is the book. It is distributed in the States by the University of Chicago Press. And of course, I would be delighted to answer any of your queries or questions or to hear your comments.
What a story. It's great to see the presentation after reading your book. It just brings it all to light as well. So I'll begin with questions. Was this area once called East Street, George, as some of my family lived there, and Whitechapel in the late 1880s to early 1900s?
It's a very close area. So Whitechapel was actually where George Gardstein was taken back to and where he died after suffering his bullet wounds. And Whitechapel and Stepney were neighbouring areas. So it's not exactly the same area, but it would be within a 10 or 15-minute walk. And of course, there were, as I say, probably 160,000 migrants from Eastern Europe, overwhelmingly Jewish, who made their homes in the East End in the years before the First World War. Quite a large number of them moved on to the US, either within a matter of months or sometimes within a matter of years. In fact, it's quite often said that quite a few of the migrants who ended up in London thought they'd landed in New York and were somewhat disappointed to discover that they hadn't actually made it across the Atlantic, just across the North Sea.
During his time, was Peter Kropotkin Kropotkin, I'm terrible with that, sorry, still in London? If so, what was his reaction to these events?
Kropotkin was in London. He was living in North London. He wasn't in great health. And actually, the three most prominent anarchist intellectuals of the era were all in exile in London. Peter Kropotkin, who was Russian, Enrico Malatesta, who was Italian, and Rudolf Rocker, who was the German who taught himself Yiddish. And the police found translations of some of Kropotkin's pamphlets in the possessions of some of the suspects whose rooms they raided. And quite a lot of the items that they seized are still in the archives. Kropotkin and Malatesta and Rocker were all very strongly against this revolutionary expropriation. They were very much against anarchists resorting to armed crime, even if it was to raise money for the movement. They said, look, even if there is a case for it in under Tsarist oppression, they didn't say there was, but even if there was, there simply was no case for it in London, which was much more tolerant and gave the anarchist diaspora the chance to organize and publish and propagandize. So I think there was a real divide there. So Rocker was really quite embarrassed that the Latvians had met and to some extent planned in his club. And he actually said afterwards that his message to them was, anarchists can find refuge in London. We can have a club. We can publish our papers. We can send our papers back home. If you carry out these armed crimes and public opinion turns against us, the government will be forced to limit the right of asylum, and then we'll all be forced out. All of us will have to go. Our papers will close, our clubs will close, and we'll be in a much weaker position. So that was a pragmatic argument, but he also had a principled opposition, as did Kropotkin, to the use of firearms in attempted robberies, even if there was a nominal political purpose.
The newspaper headline suggests the anarchists committed suicide. Was that the common belief at the time?
It was, the police, at least initially, allowed people to think this. And it was only when the inquest was held, only a few weeks later, that it was revealed that one of them had suffered a bullet wound, and it was clear from the bullet that it hadn't been self-inflicted, and the other had died of smoke inhalation. I think one of the reasons why the reporters jumped to that conclusion, a rather shoddy journalism, I speak as a former journalist myself, is because there had been an attempted wages robbery by Latvian anarchists in a different part of London, where the two anarchists did shoot themselves when they were trapped. So I think there was a rather brave and reckless assumption that if the anarchists had shot themselves in that incident, they must have done so again in Stepney, but that wasn't accurate. And by the way, the title of my book, A Devilish Kind of Courage, comes from a description in the Daily Chronicle, a mainstream daily paper, of the gunmen themselves. They had a devilish kind of courage. They were devilish. They were firing shots at the police and at troops, though not at members of the public. They never aimed shots at bystanders. They didn't actually train their guns on Winston Churchill. I don't know if they recognized him. But they also displayed a certain amount of courage and resolution in withstanding volley after volley of gunfire for as long as 6 hours.
That was one of the things that struck me in the photograph on the street, where the crowds are there and they have no sense that they're in danger. Or you said the anarchists thought robbery an acceptable way to raise money. Were there other robberies in England that are documented to have been done by anarchists?
Yes. So there was one in Tottenham, which is the one I referred to, which was the attempted wages robbery, where actually these were two Latvian anarchist gunmen, did manage to snatch a wages bag. It had about £80 in it, £80 all in coins. £80 is about about $15,000 in today's money, roughly. So a decent haul. The money was never recovered, but the Latvians, as I say, both shot themselves. They never managed to pass it on to members of the gang. And there was another attempted robbery which went wrong near Glasgow in Scotland, where again, certainly one of the robbers was a Latvian and probably an anarchist. What we don't know is how many times Latvian anarchists went to stage a robbery and got away with it and made out with whatever they were stealing without having to use their guns. There's fairly good evidence that they successfully robbed a jewellery store in Old Street in central London a year or so before the Siege of Sidney Street, and it's very likely that they kept on resorting to armed robbery because usually it worked for them. And certainly there's some evidence that they pawned items of jewellery, because the pawn tickets were found, pawned items of jewellery which they probably robbed. We can't be absolutely sure of the provenance, but they probably robbed. So yes, they got away with it, certainly on a few occasions, and there were other occasions when it all went wrong. Not quite as dramatically as this particular incident, but still, it went wrong for them.
Was there any reaction to these events by radical socialists, Bolsheviks, for example, and by Irish nationalists?
Well, that's an interesting point. So Bolsheviks, yes. I mean, the Bolsheviks disapproved of the anarchists. They thought they were wild men, undisciplined, reckless. And the Social Democrats, which was the contemporary parlance for Marxists, the Latvian Social Democrats in London very vigorously denounced the anarchists and the use of weapons in this fashion. The Marxists had used revolutionary expropriation themselves earlier, but by this date they had turned their back on it. Now, the Irish nationalists, I don't know of any direct Irish nationalist comment on the Siege of Sidney Street, but actually the form of gun that the anarchists used, the Mauser broom handle it was called, was used by Irish nationalists in the Easter Rising just 5 years later. And they called it the Peter the Painter. They nicknamed their guns the Peter the Painter. So they were certainly aware of what the Latvian anarchists had been doing in London, and they were clearly not entirely disapproving, shall we say, of the alleged ringleader of the Latvians, Peter the Painter.
Were most or many of these anarchists Jewish, or did they use this area because they felt comfortable among a populace from Eastern Europe?
I think it's mainly the latter. They found accommodation there. They spoke the same language. Quite a few of the groups spoke Yiddish. So Nina Vasileva spoke Yiddish as her first language, and she was almost certainly Jewish. Peter the Painter had some Yiddish, and his mother was probably Jewish. William Sokolov, another of the gang, was Russian and very probably Jewish. I say very probably, it sounds rather peculiar, but the anarchists use so many assumed names that it's not entirely clear sometimes what their real name, their born name, was. In some cases we know, in other cases we don't. And they were, I think without exception, irreligious. So they didn't make, I mean, they never described themselves as Jewish or indeed as Christian. They just didn't regard themselves as having a religious identity. So it's not at all clear, but I think the likelihood is that while there were some people of Jewish heritage among the Latvian gang, most were not Jewish.
Did this incident receive as much press internationally, or was it really something based in England in terms of press coverage?
It received a lot of press attention internationally. I think I think the continental press and the American press as well were sort of still thought that actually these sort of episodes were the dramatic episodes, anarchists using weapons, had a certain popular resonance. After all, it wasn't that many years before that anarchists had, in a course of just a few years, killed an American president, an Italian king, a French president, and 2 other European heads of government. That was a different style of anarchism, and that sort of propaganda by the deed had largely died out, apart from in Russia perhaps by 1910, 1911. But there was still that association with anarchism and international menace and violence and skullduggery, which papers around the world seized on. And with Peter the Painter, it's just such a marvelous alliterative nickname. They had a name and very quickly a face that they could use as a sort of peg for their stories. And the search for Peter the Painter, even though the police eventually gave up looking for him, but that search had a real international aspect to it. People were reporting, one person reported that he'd been found as a visiting preacher in the western part of the US. Another said that he was on passage to India. Another said that he'd been seen in the north of England. Another had seen him on a ferry crossing the North Sea to Antwerp. There were lots of reports from around the world saying, we've seen Peter the Painter. Almost all of them are probably nonsense. But of course, the police had to at least give some attention to them all. And the press loved reporting it. They'd report every little lead, even if it was not leading anywhere.
My family are from that area. I spent a lot of time just off of Sidney Street at my grandparents'. Why did Churchill attend the siege, and what political capital did he gain?
Why did Churchill attend the siege?
Oh, yeah, I was wondering what that was. There's a correction. Well, it was a typo. There were 2. Sorry.
Well, if we go by his own account, he was the Home Secretary. In his office in Westminster, he could find out virtually nothing about what was happening in Stepney. He knew there was a gun battle underway. He knew that 2 of the suspects in the police murders had been besieged. He'd heard that a police officer had been badly injured. In fact, he'd been told that police officer had died at Sidney Street, but that was incorrect. And he was very frustrated. The police were telling him nothing. He was finding out more from the first edition of the evening newspapers than he was finding out from police headquarters. He was young. He was a man of action. He'd served in the armed forces. So he thought, I'm going to go there. And rather recklessly, he did. And it was just 3 miles from Westminster to Sidney Street in Stepney. And I think he thought, actually, all the other politicians are much older. They're set in their ways. They don't do this sort of thing. I'm going to prove I'm something different. I'm a breath of fresh air. I'm going to go to the scene. I'm going to have a profile there. He certainly had a profile. The photographs of him at Sidney Street became postcards, which sold in their tens of thousands. You can buy them secondhand today, not very expensively, because there were so many of them. And it rather rebounded on him because the leader of the opposition in Parliament said to Churchill directly, I saw your photograph at the Siege of Sidney Street. I know what the photographer was doing there, but what was the right honourable member doing there? In other words, what on earth was a government minister doing at a live shootout? And the police, the police were really quite upset because they kept quiet because he was their political master. But with Churchill there, nobody was quite sure who was directing operations. Was it the police? Was it their political boss? And as much as Churchill might say, I was never directing operations, that's not entirely true. And of course, if people like the fire brigade officer are looking, who do I go for for instructions? Is it the police or is it Winston Churchill? They're going to go to Churchill. And of course, he was very visible, and everybody could recognize him.
Did this event increase or decrease the popularity of the anarchist movement in London?
It's strange because, Rocker described Sidney Street and the aftermath as a nightmare. He said, for the movement, he said that they gave up the Jubilee Street Club. In fact, they'd given it up just before Sidney Street. But I think in part because they didn't want to be involved with hot-headed expropriators. And the movement probably wasn't quite strong enough to keep the club going. It was costing them a lot of money as well. And the fortunes of the movement dipped for a while, but actually in 1912 they recovered. 1912, the anarchists staged an industry-wide strike in London in the tailoring trade, which was the main trade for many Jewish migrants, to protest and to try and end the sweating system of extreme subdivision of subcontractors. And during that strike, the Arbeiterfreund was published as a daily paper. And basically, the strikers won, or at least they won concessions, which Rudolf Rocker could say amounted to a victory. And for the next couple of years until the First World War, the anarchist movement was at its greatest strength. And then First World War came, and Rocker was interned as an enemy alien. He was German. Der Arbeiterfreund was closed down because it was campaigning against the war. And a lot of politically engaged anarchists from the Russian Empire after the Russian Revolution actually went back to Russia to try and support the revolution. It may not have been their revolution, but there was a revolution and something was happening in Russia, and nothing very much in political terms was happening in London. So the anarchist movement by the end of the First World War in London was in a very weak state. It managed to restart the Arbeiterfreund, but many years ago I interviewed a very elderly woman who had been a Jewish anarchist in the East End, then went to Moscow and then went to Palestine, came back to London in 1928. And she said to me, she spoke in a very pronounced East European accent throughout her life. And she said, when I came back, the anarchist movement, it was like a cemetery. It stank. In other words, she was saying it was all old people, no young people. The energy and the youth and the vigor had evaporated.
Any comments about the cinematic scene of Hitchcock's 1934 version of The Man Who Knew Too Much, which was inspired by the siege ?
I think he certainly had the siege in mind. This was one of his early films. Hitchcock grew up in the East End of London. He was only a child at the time of Sidney Street, but he lived not more than a mile away. I think there's no doubt that he had the siege in mind for that denouement of this film, very loosely based on the Siege of Sidney Street. And also Simenon wrote what his first Maigret short story was about. Its title was, in translation, Peter the Latvian, and it was clearly in part based on Sidney Street. And then there was another feature film in 1960 which was called The Siege of Sidney Street, and it had actors such as Donald Sinden, quite a well-known British actor, which tried very hard to be factual. It was a feature film and they wanted to have a little bit of love interest and one or two other things. But broadly, they did their best to stick to the main outlines of the plot. And Emanuel Litvinov wrote A Death Out of Season, which is really a very good novel based on the Siege of Sidney Street. So the siege and the shootout has been a source not just for Hitchcock, but for quite a few writers and filmmakers down the years.
I'm going to toss out a couple of very, I hope, quick questions because we do have to wrap up. Was Gardstein's girlfriend pregnant?
Somebody is very well informed. Her name was Luba Milstein. She was pregnant. Whether Gardstein knew she was pregnant at the time he died, I don't know. And she made her way to New York, where she actually lived for the rest of her life with another member of the gang, a more distant member of the gang, and her child was born, boy. And so yes, that's absolutely right. So it's quite a, I mean, and Luba and her husband, who had been involved in the anarchist movement in New York between the wars, they became very ardent communists.
We do have a few people in the virtual audience who seem to have connections to this event. One of them is left, if I may share this, we're not supposed to take comments, but he recounts that his grandfather was present at the siege. In my youth, I went to Israel and I met a gentleman who was a very young policeman at the siege. He suggested that they set fire to the house. Mr. Churchill remarked, "What a charming young man." My two connections to the siege.
That's lovely. I have a website, andrewwhitehead.net, and that has an email address on it. So if anybody did want to get in touch with me, I would just love to hear from people who've got family connections or stories of that sort, because they are fascinating. And I'm, from talking about the book in London, every time I talk about the book in London, somebody comes up to me at the end and says, "My family lived just there," or "I had a great uncle who was a policeman who was present at the siege." And it's just, and you get little snippets of gossip which has been passed down as family folklore, and it just is really, it's really quite remarkable how this event has survived in popular memory. And even, quite remarkably, some blocks of flats were built on Sidney Street just 15 years ago, and the housing association, I'm not sure, I think this was a good move, but the housing association named the two blocks Peter House and Painter House. Not in tribute to Peter the Painter, but looking back on a distant sort of local figure who'd attracted a great deal of attention. The police trade union was furious, and I can absolutely see why. Peter the Painter was a conspirator in the police murder, but nevertheless, they are still named Peter House and Painter House.
The book, again, for all of you out there, and it's highly recommended, The Siege of Sidney Street, the East End of London's most sensational shootout, by Andrew Whitehead. It is available in the Yiddish Book Center's on-site and online bookstore, shop.yiddishbookcenter.org, and wherever fine books are sold. I want to thank you very much, and I want to thank colleague, friend, and mutual friend and colleague for you as well, David Mazauer, the Yiddish Book Center's researcher and Chief Curator of Yiddish Global Culture, for making this introduction and urging me to read the book, which prompted this. So keep writing, keep in touch, and thank you so much. I hope you get some sleep now.
Thank you, Lisa. And I've really enjoyed talking to your virtual audience. You're absolutely right. David Mazauer was a great help, and he helped me to identify articles in the Yiddish press, which I then got translated. So I owe a great debt to him and to Roberta Newman, who did the translating from the Yiddish. I'd also like to thank Oren, who was the technical guy who made sure that everything went as smoothly as I hope it did. So thank you to you all, and goodbye.
Thank you. And yes, a big thanks to Oren, who is in the midst of a rather crazy situation at the same time. Thanks again for all of you for joining us. Please join us at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts, Sunday, October 20th at 2 p.m., when we will screen The Last New Yorker. Following the screening, the director, Harvey Wang, will join us for a talkback and possibly with a special guest. Also at the center, you can visit and view Harvey Wang, the photographer, as exhibit on the Last of the New Yorkers as well. To view our full lineup of upcoming and in-person and live stream events, and to register for those events, please visit yiddishbookcenter.org/events. If you're in the area, drop by the center to view and tour Yiddish Global Culture, our landmark exhibition. And I want to thank all of you out there, all of our members who make all of the Yiddish Book Center's ongoing work possible. Please consider becoming a member, renewing, sharing a membership with a friend. For more information about that and how to plan your visit and to access all of our online resources, yiddishbookcenter.org. Until the next time we see you in our audience, stay well, stay happy, and thanks again for joining us this evening. Good night.